This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, Summer May Finlay here, taking week 7's lecture on racism for HAS350, Indigenous Social Determinants of Health. Before we go any further, I of course would like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the country we're all meeting on today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. The traditional owners of this country have taken care of it for millennia. We are very lucky to live here, and I feel very privileged to walk on this country and work on this country. So I just want you to stop and maybe think about, despite being in the middle of a pandemic, how lucky we are to have the country that we do. And I also just want to acknowledge that when we had our tutorial, at least for the Wednesday class, that everyone's getting out and walking. So I know that you are definitely walking on this country and appreciating it, given how much time you need to spend inside. So I just want to acknowledge and pay respects to elders, past and present. Extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that might be with us today, and also to everybody else for joining. So thank you. Now look, I need to be really upfront with you and say this lecture comes with a trigger warning. All of the lectures can be quite challenging. We know that. Often we're dealing with very heavy content. Often we're also dealing with content which might actually challenge the way you think or might be different to what you've been taught before. This lecture in particular can be very challenging for people. Now, I want to say up front that Nadia and I understand that this is challenging. We respect that this might bring up some emotions or conflicting thoughts for you. And we really encourage you to actually talk to us if you're feeling particularly challenged. Now, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or other people of colour or of different nationalities or racial backgrounds, this might also be challenging for you for other reasons. So we do want to actually always be mindful that the way we feel about this is our really personal feelings. And what we want to do if you are triggered is I want you to stop, I want you to breathe, reflect, pause, and reflect some more. Essentially, what we're asking you to do through this particular subject, if you are finding the content challenging, is to actually figure out and explore the reasons why. Every one of us has challenging thoughts and emotions. We get annoyed at people with the way they drive. We get annoyed at people because they walk too slow or because they talk too fast or whatever it is. And when it comes to race, we know that there are some particular dialogues that happen around race. And we know that people have particular worldviews around race. So what we're going to present today is a theoretical concept of race and racism. We're going to talk to you about the different types of racism, because of course there are many. Then we're going to be looking at the impact of racism on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the way forward. So that's going to be broken up into different sections across this lecture. So there'll be multiple videos on multiple aspects of that. What this particular component is looking at the theoretical concepts of race and racism. So again, I do just want to actually remind you that if any stage you find this challenging, just stop, breathe, reflect, pause, and reflect some more. And use whatever you're feeling in your reflective journal. So firstly, we need to, before we actually understand racism, we need to understand discrimination. What is discrimination? Discrimination, according to Australian law, is the direct discrimination takes place when a person is treated less favourably than another person in the same or similar circumstances. So in practice, what that can mean is discrimination can be based on age, breastfeeding, family responsibility, family status, fine enforcements, gender, impairment, marital status, political conviction, a whole range of things, including race. So we need to remember that racism is a form of discrimination. And in this country, discrimination based on any of the characteristics you see on the slide there is actually illegal. So what is racism? It's a really tricky question, but before we actually think about what racism is, we actually need to think about what race is. Now, the definition of race has changed over time. What we know about race is that originally people were divided into distinct groups based on inherited physical and behavioural differences. And look, this started, the concept around biological race started in about the 15th century. And that's largely when people started to colonize countries, be able to be more mobile because of ships and things like that. But the concept of race was really formalized in the 1700s when we actually saw the processes of colonization across the world had actually occurred a lot more, and people were starting to understand how different people in different countries behaved, lived, thought, knew. And again, as I said, race was originally defined based on what you could see, seeing being the physical characteristics of a person, but also the way someone behaved. Now, as technology evolved and science evolved, so did the definition of race. What we knew is that by the 20th century, when we were starting to actually have genetic studies, people started to realize that genetics did not define race. What this means is that there is no significant genetic difference in people across the world that can be used to define race. Now, this might actually conflict with what you have heard before, because people like Mark Latham, for example, One Nation politician, former Labor politician, actually made a comment at the last election around wanting to test people to see whether or not they actually were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So there is a thing that people are looking for in races, which is called a reference genome or reference genomes. Essentially, that doesn't define race or actually make me behave as an Aboriginal person, but it is a genetic variation which has been passed down potentially through the generations, and because of people living in discrete groups, those genetic variations have become widespread across that particular group, and then actually are transferred to future generations. But at no time does that, what they call the racial genome or genomes, actually define us as a race of people, because it doesn't actually have codes in it that tell us how to behave, how to think, what we call knowing, being, and doing. So race now is considered to be a social construct which is based on culture. However, many people still believe that race is based on physical variations amongst groups. And it is because it was so widespread, that belief, that it is something that continues today. But fundamentally, it is based on culture and historical connection with a people. By the way, working from home, you get the joy of listening to everything that I hear. I'm sure you hear that there's a child outside. It is not my child, it's the child downstairs. They have a courtyard, and unfortunately, the courtyard is tiled and it resonates and acts as an amplifier. Just before I started as well, the neighbour upstairs was actually drilling. So apologies for the background noise, but it's just one of the things we deal with when we're actually working from home. So what is racism? Now, racism is something that has multiple definitions depending on who you talk to. So the first one that you would hear about is racism is, from a dictionary definition, is poor treatment or violence against people because of their race. What it essentially is also based on is that a superiority, that one race is better than another race. And we actually see this most prominently in white supremacy, the belief that people of a white skin colour and white background actually are superior to those of a darker skin colour. Now, a more theoretical notion of race is described by Bobo and Fox. Racism is a set of institutional conditions of groups. Sorry, that kid's just going bonkers. I don't know if you can hear him, but he's certainly having a good time downstairs. Racism is a set of institutional conditions of group inequality and an ideology of racial domination, in which the latter is characterised by a set of beliefs holding that the subordinate racial group is biologically or culturally inferior to the dominant racial group. These beliefs, in turn, are deployed as prescribed and legitimise society's discriminatory treatment of the subordinate group and to justify their lower status. Now, there are some small differences in those definitions. So I actually just want you to take a minute and actually read those definitions again and think about what you perceive to be some of the differences. One of the biggest difference in this is the position of power. So racism, when you break it down, is racism equals prejudice plus power. So it is a prejudicial belief, i.e. that prejudice is a belief which is held based on incorrect or information that's not factual, and power. And when we're talking about power, we're talking about a power imbalance. So prejudice versus racism. Prejudice in and of itself is not racism. I could be prejudiced against somebody because they're short or tall or old. But prejudice is a preconceived opinion of another person not based on any reason or experience. So I am prejudiced against you because I believe you're going to be late because people of colour are late. That is based on nothing but a belief that I hold that's factually incorrect because you have never demonstrated to me that you are late. So therefore, I'm only basing that on what I look at you and I see that you might be different. That's how people interact. That's how prejudice is formed and actually used. So prejudice can be positive or negative. Um, Again, thinking about an example of that, there is a prejudicial belief that people who are African American are good at sport. Now, that is a positive prejudice, but that may not necessarily be the case. And anyone who has actually seen black comedy has actually seen a skit, I think it was from season 1, which is exactly about that. Skit where a young boy was given a sports scholarship because he was Aboriginal to a private school, except that he was just absolutely hopeless at sport. Um, some, but not all, are racial in nature and have racist outcomes, unlikely to impact people as negatively as racism. So the way I think about you on a superficial level being late because you're old and you walk slow is not necessarily going to be as negative as racism. So racism is a belief that race is equated with particular traits, belief that some races are superior to others, and that's really important because that's where the power dynamic comes in. If I'm superior than you at something, then I should be the one that has the right to hold the power, and results in an unequal distribution of power based on the basis of race. And we see that with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we see that with African Americans, we see that with Māori. So what we see is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, say in a policy context, are often excluded or have been traditionally excluded from the decision-making process because it was deemed that they weren't well educated enough or didn't understand communities well enough or a whole bunch of things. So it was this distribution of power. Now, the thing with racism and prejudice is that there is a difference between conscious and unconscious. So we see a really explicit, conscious decision to be racist when we see things like the Ku Klux Klan. When we're talking about white supremacy in its substantive form, where people go out of their way to be racist, go out of their way to exercise their power based on a belief that they are superior than anybody else. Then there is the unconscious racism, and this is often where the prejudice comes in. So what we actually know is that the way we form our beliefs, attitudes is based on the knowledge that we gain through our life. So whether it's from our parents, whether it's from our school system, and essentially over time, we start to build up our belief structure. And sometimes we don't even know we hold particular belief structures until something happens or we read something that either challenges or reaffirms that particular belief structure. So that's the unconscious. Now, it's really important to understand that racism can be both conscious and unconscious, because Nadia is actually going to talk about the different types of racism, and they're either going to be conscious or unconscious. And it's really important that you actually start to explore your own particular beliefs and think about whether or not they're consciously held or they're unconscious throughout this process. So I'm just about to finish, but I just want to sum up to say that we need to remember that racism is not just a belief about race. So we can actually talk about race and it not necessarily be racism. So we can talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which we do in this subject. But what we're not doing is actually applying prejudice and creating a power imbalance to disadvantage people when we're talking about them. So the minute we actually start to believe that we know more than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a particular community, and then we apply that belief in, say, a policy context or a funding round, for example, then that's when we start to actually have issues with racism. So I really, again, want you to think about when you're listening to what Nadia talks about in the next session, start thinking about the definition of race and how race has defined people based on behaviours and physical characteristics, and how that carries through to today, and how that over time has created a power imbalance because there's been an attitude that Western society in particular is superior to other races. Now, you may not hold that belief consciously, and many of you won't even hold that belief firmly subconsciously. But what you may find is that some of what you think you know is based on a belief that is actually factually incorrect, and that is where you can actually spend some time thinking about where that belief came from and the validity of that belief. So again, I know that this lecture can be quite challenging, and I want to remind you that if you are triggered, that we want you to stop, breathe, reflect, pause again, and reflect some more. Really hope that you have gained a greater understanding of race, racism, and how racism manifests a little bit in real life, and we'll explore it more over the rest of the lecture. Thanks very much.